Today, we assess the validity of the historical statement that Andrew Jackson was foremost a tyrant, then a Federalist, then an anti-Federalist. The claim that Andrew Jackson was a tyrant, Federalist, and then anti-Federalist in that order is only partially valid. Andrew Jackson's abuse of presidential power and his lack of respect for federal government place him awfully close to meriting the title of tyrant, but not quite there. And his dominant streak does not make him a Federalist. Rather, he acted as an anti-Federalist who simply concentrated power into his own hands due to desire for authority. Alright, we're going to move on now to topic 1. Although Andrew Jackson exercised his power quite arbitrarily, he did so as the figurehead of an era of mass democracy and ergo couldn't act as an entirely oppressive despot. It's however undeniable how much excessive authority he did concentrate into his own seat, and his behavior makes him foremost a stubborn and uncompromising president with an iron fist. Tyrant, however, is still too strong a word for our taste. Perhaps the central idea that drives the perception that Andrew Jackson was a dictatorial leader is his inability to comply with other branches of government. For example, he openly flouted the Supreme Court concerning the Native American question. Twice, the Supreme Court ruled forcible removal of Native Americans from their native lands unconstitutional, and twice, Andrew Jackson ignored it. He justified himself by saying he believed natives would die out if integrated into American society. But still, come on. He even went so far as to say, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. John Marshall was the Supreme Court Justice at the time. His policy thus led to the mass removal of natives along the Trail of Tears, where countless unwilling died on the way to Oklahoma. However, we should note that Jackson's perspective on natives isn't wholly negative and is actually quite complex because he fought fiercely against them in early adulthood as a soldier, but also later adopted a Creole son. Anyway, Jackson went on to defy even Congress, then a much more influential body than the more recently relevant Marshall Court, given that judicial review was still a relatively new idea. Jackson used the presidential veto extensively for controversial and sometimes trivial reasons, like road building. In particular, he fought actively against any reform movements that required government activism. This shows anti-federalist leanings in his policy that we'll get to again later. At any rate, Congress was neither in support of Jackson nor willing to rebel against him and oppose him outright, which led to ambivalency and an initial lack of progress. Furthermore, Jackson's use of the spoil system was also indicative of despotic rule, and he was accused of installation of cronies in office to gain control of government. This, however, is not as strong a point as others, because Jackson only replaced maybe 10% of office holders, and the only reason he in particular is associated with this cronyism and spoil system is that he was the first real outsider president. Therefore, the cronies that he brought in were new and distinct from those that had previously been recycled around in the old administrations. Given all this evidence, however, Jackson's stubborn attitude with governmental bodies still didn't reflect an entirely tyrannical mindset. This is because Jackson presided over the era of the common man, and himself was the epitome of a self-made man. His appeal to the masses led to much public support at the voting booths, and during his administration, suffrage was expanded to include all white men, landless or otherwise, reflecting an expansion of democracy in his time. This wasn't only a legal expansion on paper, mind you. Voter participation actually shot up from maybe 20% to 70% within his administration. Jackson's power was also not unlimited. Congress still vetoed over his veto power at times. In summary, despite being self-centered and stubborn as an old hickory, see what I did there? Jackson fought as champion of the common man through his policy, and we can't really label him as a cruel and oppressive tyrant. This now brings us to a consideration of Jackson's political stance in terms of federalism and anti-federalism. Topic 2. Although Jackson's heavy wielding of his influence and concentration of power into his own hands suggested federalist leanings, he actually pursued anti-federalist policy and was at heart an anti-federalist. Of course, this being Andrew Jackson, he was perfectly willing to throw aside his political alignment if the situation warranted action. We'll get into that later. First, we find that the methods by which Jackson controlled his seat seem to imply a little bit that he acted as a Federalist. Chief among these was his centralization of political power. He tended to bring political sway mostly into his own hands, as we've already discussed, and we see such centralization in his addressing of the nullification crisis. When the southern states nullified the anger-inciting tariff of 1828 that was so unpopular in the region at the time, Jackson did not take it well. Although generally a supporter of states' rights, he took particularly federalist actions here by threatening to send troops into the states that nullified the tariff. His threats coagulated into the force bill that Jackson pushed in response to Calhoun's South Carolina's nullification of the tariff. Also, a side note, at this time of his presidency, Jackson was also kind of a wealthy planter who no longer was as much a part of the common man as his image and the name of the era dictated. Despite all this Federalist-seeming evidence, the argument that Jackson was an anti-Federalist still holds more merit. His actions and dynamics in the White House made his stance undeniably clear. This is first seen in his humble beginnings and common support. Most anti-Federalists at the time came from poor agricultural backgrounds, and many from this voting bloc supported Jackson because of his wild, murky early life, away from the cultured and chilly New English cities. Jackson's faith in the masses and the masses' faith in him suggested that he would favor the empowerment of local government while in office. Furthermore, Jackson's relationships with other politicians suggested he was an anti-Federalist. The fact that Jackson was political enemies with the very famously pro-central government, Henry Clay. Pro-central government is a very Federalist characteristic. Makes it very difficult to argue that Jackson was a Federalist. In general, Jackson's policies were thus typically anti-Federalist, and he pursued goals in office that were very aligned with this political camp. One major change that Andrew Jackson pursued was the downsizing of federal government, even while increasing his own power. This was still a decidedly anti-Federalist move, however, given the Federalist support of a large, strong central government, as mentioned earlier. As also mentioned earlier, Jackson was also vehemently against government policy that required active intrusion into private lives and property, which leads us nicely into one of the most obviously anti-Federalist pursuits of Jackson's career, the Bank War. Jackson was also vehemently opposed to the Second Bank of the United States and sought to eliminate it whilst arguing that a federally owned monopoly of the bank was unconstitutional and unjust to the American people. This is a very classic anti-federal viewpoint, especially since the National Bank is seen as such a Federalist institute, given that the first Federalist really, Alexander Hamilton, was the first creator of the National Bank. Eventually, Jackson succeeded in killing the bank and encouraged the use of private wildcat banks scattered around the country. Although this was unsound economic policy, it did still show his dedication to the anti-Federalist cause at heart. Furthermore, taking a deeper look at Jackson's fight for national unity during the nullification crisis that was already talked about, we can conclude that this quote-unquote Federalist action was actually just another one of his power moves. Andrew Jackson could not tolerate dissension from the states that undermined his authority, and consequently moved against them despite his preference for states' rights and a smaller federal government. Alright, in summary, it should be clear that Jackson was more Federalist than anti-Federalist, and although abusive of his power, not oppressive enough to be called a tyrant. The Bank War and the nullification crisis, along with other aspects of Jacksonian policy and democracy, emphasized an anti-federal stance. Jackson's other conflicts with government similarly highlighted some dictatorial tendencies on his part. However, his leadership in the era of the common man makes it hard to pin him down as a tyrant. That's all, guys. Thanks so much for listening.